In the name of Lord Jesus Christ, I begin tonight's message.
奉主耶稣的圣名开始今晚的讲道。
Today, I would like to share about the topic lessons from David's servitude.
今天想和大家分享的主题就是从大卫身上所得到的学习。
Specifically about the time when David attempted, in his first time, to bring the ark back into Jerusalem.
那特别是要讲到第一次大卫想要将神的约柜运回耶路撒冷的时候。
Now, why did I say first attempt? It is because the first attempt was unsuccessful, and only at the second attempt was David successful in bringing it back.
那为什么我讲第一次试图运回呢？因为第一次试图运回的时候是失败的，只有在第二次运的时候才是成功的。
And its failure was because of the many flaws that David and the Israelites had when they served God.
那失败的原因是大卫以及以色列民当时他们侍奉神时候的许多缺陷。
And what this story really teaches us is that when we are placed in a position to serve God, and when we do it incorrectly or with the wrong attitude, it may cause us to die spiritually, and in their case, even physically.
那所以我想要以这个事迹就引申到我们今天，比如说当今天我们侍奉的时候，如果抱有不正确的态度或者不正确的方式，都会使我们的灵命得到损伤，或者在他们当时甚至是有人真正的死了。
Let's first turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6.
那我们先翻到撒母耳记下的第6章。
2 Samuel chapter 6 from verse 1 to 2.
撒母耳记下第6章第1到第2节。
Verse 1, Again David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000 too. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim.
第1节和第2节。第1节，大卫又聚集以色列中所有挑选的人3万。第2节，大卫起身率领跟随他的众人前往，要从巴拉犹大将神的约柜运来。这约柜就是坐在二基罗伯上万军之耶和华留名的约柜。
So in the previous, just before this, in a previous battle, King David had just conquered Jerusalem.
那在把约柜运到耶路撒冷之前，大卫刚刚得胜，然后占领了耶路撒冷。
And he settled there and made it the city of David and started gathering the choice men of Israel to this place.
那他在那里安营，然后把那个地方叫做大卫城，并且聚集以色列民中所有挑选的人。
And when he was settled, he thought it was a good idea to bring the ark back to Jerusalem.
那当他安定下来的时候，他想将神的约柜运回来，是一个非常好的主意。
Because the reason we can see from 1 Chronicles is that he thought that David wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to the city because he wanted to inquire of God again.
那我们从历代史上就能看到例子，大卫想要将神的约柜运回来，是因为他想要再次的求告神。
And the ark, and here it mentions why was the ark very important? Because the ark was where the Lord dwells between the cherubim.
那这里也提到了为什么这个约柜如此的重要，因为在这里提到这约柜就是坐在二基路伯上万军之耶和华留名的约柜。
So the people of Israel really associated the ark of God, their way of communicating and meeting with God.
那所以对于以色列民来说，约柜就是能够和神交流，并且有神同在的这样的感觉。
Let's turn very quickly to 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 3.
那我们很快的翻到历代志上第13章的第3节。
1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 3.
历代志上第13章的第3节。
Sorry, let's start from verse 2.
我们从第2节开始。
2. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, If it seems good to you, and if it is of the Lord our God, let us send out to our brethren everywhere who are left in all the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and Levites who are in their cities and their common lands, that they may gather to us. 3. And let us bring the ark of God back to us, for we have not inquired at it since the days of Saul.
历代志上第13章的第2节和第3节。第2节，大卫对以色列全会众说：你们若以为美，见这事是出于耶和华我们的神，我们就差遣人走遍以色列地，见我们未来的弟兄，又见住在有郊野之城的祭司利未人，使他们都到这里来聚集。第3节，我们要把神的约柜运到我们这里来，因为在扫罗年间，我们没有在约柜前求问神。
So this was David's desire in bringing back the ark.
那这就是大卫想要将神的约柜运回来的这份心意。
Let's return back to 2 Samuel chapter 6.
那我们翻回到撒母耳记下的第6章。
The ark of the covenant also represents the abidance of God.
那神的约柜也就代表神的同在。
So if the ark of God was not with them, and some of them also felt that God's abidance departed from them.
那所以有很多的人感觉神的约柜没有和他们在一起，所以神的同在就没有神的同在了。
And according to this verse, the ark sat in a city called Baal Judah.
那根据这一节的这里就是神的约柜在巴拉犹大这个城。
And it remained here for some time. And in this verse, it also tells us that this city was known by another name.
那在这里我们知道了停留在这个巴拉犹大已经有很长一段时间了，然后巴拉犹大还有另外一个名字。
If we look at the footnote of Baal Judah, here it tells us here that another name for it is Kirjath Jearim.
那如果我们看底下的小字的话，我们就能知道它的另外一个名字叫基列耶林。
And it was in this little city, it was about a 7 to 8 mile journey to Jerusalem.
那基列耶林离耶路撒冷大概有7到8公里的距离。
And this is and now they try to bring this ark back to the holy city Jerusalem.
那所以现在他们要想将神的约柜运回这圣城耶路撒冷。
So this is sort of the background to the main message.
那这就是我们今天要分享主题的一些背景。
Let's continue reading from 2 Samuel chapter 6 from verse 3 to 5.
那我们再来读撒母耳记下的第6章的第3到第5节。
3. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. 4. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. 5. Then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals.
第3到第5节，第3节，他们将神的约柜从冈上亚比拿达的家里抬出来，放在新车上。亚比拿达的2个儿子乌撒和亚希约赶着新车。第4节，他们将神的约柜从冈上亚比拿达家里抬出来的时候，亚希约在柜前行走。第5节，大卫和以色列的全家在耶和华面前用松木制造的各样乐器和琴、瑟、鼓、钹、锣作乐跳舞。
And so here we see David's first mistake.
那我们在这里看到大卫的第一个错误。
The first mistake that David and the Israelites made when they were serving God was that their service was tainted by the world.
那我们第一个所能看到他们犯的错误，就是他们侍奉神的方式被世界上所影响。
And how exactly was David and the Israelites' service tainted by the world?
那他们是怎么样被这个世界上的这些作为所玷污了呢？
If we read 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 3 in the very first part, here it says that they set the ark of God on a new cart.
因为我们可以读第3节，他们将神的约柜从家里抬出来，放在新车上。
And we know from the Old Testament, in the books of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we know about how the Israelites were supposed to carry the ark.
那我们从旧约的前5本 前5本书里面就可以知道，我们以色列民是应当怎么样的来抬这个约柜。
If we read Exodus chapter 25 and certain passages in Numbers, we know that the Israelites were supposed to carry the ark with poles, and only Levites and priests were supposed to carry them.
那如果我们来读出埃及记第25章的话，我们就能知道，一定要是用杠来抬，并且必须是要利未人来做这件事情。
If we read the first 5 books of Moses, we know that the Ark of the Covenant was never supposed to be placed on a cart.
如果我们来读摩西5经的话，我们就知道，这约柜从来都不应该放在车上。
And from reading this entire chapter, we know that the Ark of the Covenant was placed on a cart that was carried by an oxen in verse 6.
那如果我们来读到第6节的话，我们就知道他们将神的约柜抬出来放在新车上，并且是用牛来赶这辆车。
So in God's laws and instructions, where it was very clear on how to carry the ark, why did they then decide to place this ark on a cart?
那如果我们根据神在旧约里面给的律法，我们很清楚的知道，是要来抬的话，为什么要将它放在新车上呢？
Where did the Israelites or where did David get this idea from?
那大卫又是从哪里看到了这样的主意呢？
The only other mention of the Ark of the Covenant being carried by a cart was in the book of 1 Samuel.
那如果我们看到这个约柜被被放在车上的话，我们能看到我们来看撒母耳记上。
In the very beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, we know that in the time of Eli, there was war between the Israelites and the Philistines.
那如果我们看撒母耳记上前面的话，我们知道在那时，以色列和非利士人之间有征战。
In 1 Samuel chapter 6, from verse 6 to 11, we may not have to turn to this passage, but in summary, when the Ark of the Covenant was captured, and essentially they placed it alongside their images and their idols.
那所以我们不一定要翻到这个章节，但是这个故事的总结就是，当约柜被非利士人拿走以后，他们把它放在他们的神庙和他们的偶像中间。
But certain things started happening, and they became very afraid, and they wanted to send the ark back.
接续的发生了一些事情，使他们变得非常的惧怕，他们就想要把这个约柜送回去。
And so how did they send it back? They sent it back, along with a burnt offering, with gifts, but they also sent it back with a cart, on a cart with a beast of burden.
当然，他们在里面放上了赎罪的礼物和一些其他的礼物，他们也把它放在了一辆新车上面。
This is the only other recording mentioned in connection with how the ark was carried.
那这只有圣经中只有这一个例子是说，约柜是被放在了新车上的。
It is when the Philistines captured the ark, and when they returned the ark, they returned with an oxen cart.
那就是非利士人将神的约柜掳走之后，还回约柜的时候，把它放在一辆新车上，并且让母牛来拉这辆车。
So if we piece it together, it's very likely then that David and the Israelites, did what they did in 2 Samuel chapter 6 was from a previous precedence or occurrence of how to carry the ark.
那所以大卫他们想到了这样的主意，很有可能是看到了之前非利士人这样运输约柜的方式。
In other words, how they served God was heavily influenced by the Gentiles, the Philistines.
那换而言之，他们对于神的侍奉，很大程度的受了外邦人，就是非利士人的影响。
And so sometimes when we serve God, it's very likely that we also might be influenced by unbelievers or even other church denominations.
那所以对于今天的我们来说，我们所侍奉神的方式很有可能会被外面世界的方式所影响，或者甚至被外教派的方式所影响。
For most of us growing up in True Jesus Church, if we had not ever really had been associated with other Christian groups, you might not realize how other Christian groups tries to evangelize or invite people to come to believe.
那所以对于我们这些在真耶稣教会里面出生并且长大的信徒，我们可能对于外面教会是如何来发展他们的圣工，来召集慕道者的方式，可能对于这些都不是很熟悉。
I remember seeing some pamphlets of how other churches do this. A lot of other churches, they use methods like dancing or like a basketball game or a video game night to sort of attract youths in the neighborhood to come to their church.
那所以我看到了一个手册上写的其他外教会一些宣道的方式，就是比如说他们会有一个篮球比赛，或者甚至是有这样子游戏的竞赛，来吸引社区里面的青年来他们的教会。
And back then, when I was in high school, around the region of Markham and Richmond Hill, there were churches that were inviting people because they had badminton tournaments.
那在当时我还在读高中的时候，有一些教会，有一些在万景市和列支文山的教会，借着一些羽毛球的比赛来吸引青年来到他们的教会。
But if we think about it, what they are really trying to do is they're trying to use these activities to attract youth, and the principle is that this attraction is trying to fulfill the desires of the flesh.
那很多时候，他们用这些方式来吸引年轻人，都是所用的这些吸引的方式，都是来满足肉体的情欲的。
Because people will go simply because they're hanging out with people and it's fun.
那有一些人会去，可能只是因为有很多的人聚集在那里，非常的有趣。
And so why they are there is really to enjoy themselves. The attraction really is from sin and from fulfilling the desires of the flesh.
那所以对于他们来说，这个吸引就是要能够有这样自我的满足，所以其实也是源于罪，源于体贴肉体。
But how we should attract people to church, it really should be from the love of God and the righteousness of God.
但是如果我们想要一个人来教会的话，当然是要凭着神对人的爱以及神的公义来吸引人。
That is what should attract people, not the desires of sin.
这才应该是吸引人的地方，而不是罪的引诱。
So here we see that David and the Israelite people here, they were influenced by the Philistines.
在这里我们就看到大卫和这些以色列民，就被这些非利士人的方式所影响。
And so what they did is also a reminder for us, and this is the reason why we need to read the Bible often.
那他们这样子对于我们来说是一个很好的警惕，这也提醒了我们为什么要常常的读圣经。
To see if anything that we are doing or how we are serving God is against or opposed to the principles and the teaching of the Bible.
那在看我们所侍奉的时候，我们的这些行动或者我们这些想法是否与圣经里面的原则相违背。
And hand in hand, we also need to pray often to make sure our service to God is in accordance to the Holy Spirit.
那同样的，我们也要常常的祷告，来让我们的侍奉符合圣灵的旨意。
And from this, we also we know that our service, if it's a service that is given that is tainted by the world, God may not be very happy with us.
那当我们的侍奉被世界上的行为所玷污的时候，神可能会不太开心。
So aside from having a pure servitude, our servitude also must be aligned with God's commands.
那所以除了要能够以一颗要能够以清洁的行为来侍奉神之外，我们所侍奉的也需要和神的旨意是相同的。
Let's continue reading 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 6 to 7.
那我们再来读撒母耳记下的第6章第6和第7节。
Verse 6, And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. 7, Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error. And he died there by the ark of God.
第6节，到了拿肯的禾场，因为牛失前蹄，乌撒就伸手扶住神的约柜。第7节，神耶和华向乌撒发怒，因这错误击杀他，他就死在神的约柜旁。
So we also need to aim to have a service to God that is aligned with His commandments.
所以我们侍奉神的方式一定要能够符合他所给我们的诫命。
What we know from the Bible is that this person Uzzah, he was probably a Levite.
那如果我们从圣经上面来读的话，这个乌撒很有可能是一个利未人。
His father was Abinadab.
他的父亲是亚比拿达。
And one of his sons was consecrated, set apart for God.
那他的另外一个儿子也被分别为圣，归于神。
It's most likely implying that he was a Levite as well.
那所以很有可能这个乌撒也是一个利未人。
So as a Levite, he should actually have been familiar with the commandments of God.
那所以作为一个利未人，应当对神的律法是非常的熟悉的。
And he should have known that the furnishings of the ark should not be touched, otherwise they would be killed.
当然，他也应该知道约柜旁是不能够伸手去摸的，否则他会被击杀。
Let's turn quickly to Numbers chapter 4, verse 15.
那我们来翻到民数记的第4章的第15节。
Numbers chapter 4, verse 15.
民数记第4章的第15节。
15. And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is set to go, then the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them. But they shall not touch any holy thing, lest they die.
第15节，将要起营的时候，亚伦和他儿子把圣所和圣所的一切器具遮盖完了，歌辖的子孙就要来抬，只是不可摸圣物，免得他们死亡。
So if we return back to 2 Samuel chapter 6, we know that it wasn't Uzzah's status that incurred the wrath of God.
那所以，如果我们回到撒母耳记下的第6章的话，我们就知道，乌撒遭到神的击杀，不是因为他身份的原因。
If we read verse 6 and verse 7, we know that Uzzah here was struck down by God simply because he took hold of the ark of God.
那我们知道神来击杀乌撒，完全是因为乌撒摸了神的约柜。
And why did he touch the ark of God? Well, when they were carrying the oxen cart, right? The oxen stumbled.
那为什么他会摸到神的约柜呢？就是因为这个牛在拉这个约柜的新车的时候，他失了前蹄。
The stumbling might have caused the ark to probably almost fall, and he was probably just reaching out his hand for it to not fall.
那因为牛失前蹄，这个约柜很有可能就要从车上倒下来了。然后乌撒伸手扶住，也完全是想要扶住神的约柜。
So we can see that this might have been well-intentioned.
那很有可能他的动机是好的。
But we see that the result was that he was killed.
但是我们所看到的结果就是乌撒被击杀了。
So what does this tell us? This tells us that good intentions does not excuse us from God.
那这告诉我们一个什么样的教训呢？就是即使我们带着这样好的心意，但是这样并不能得到神的喜悦，这样在神的面前也是不可以的。
This is why the Bible tells us that we need to constantly pursue the knowledge of God. Why? It's so that we understand what things are pleasing to God and what things aren't.
这就是为什么圣经反复的提醒我们要了解属神的事情，因为这样我们才能知道什么在他眼中是看为正的，什么样在他眼中不是看为正的。
And that's why having a prayer habit is also so very important, because that is the way we communicate with the God that we serve.
那这就为什么祷告也是一件非常重要的事情，因为只有在祷告里，我们和我们所侍奉的神能够交流。
So that is to ensure that our good intentions are aligned with God's words.
也就是说，我们所带有这样的好的心意，是与神的话语不相违背的，是与神的话语相同的。
David also here bears some responsibility for Uzzah's death.
那在这里，乌撒的死，有关乌撒的死，大卫也是有脱不开的关系。
Because as a king, David was overseeing this entire mission, this entire task of bringing the Ark of Covenant back to Jerusalem.
因为作为一个王来说，大卫是来掌控这整件将神的约柜运回耶路撒冷的这整件事。
And ultimately, it was David who allowed the ark to be placed on the oxen cart in the first place.
也就是说，从一开始也是得到了大卫的允许，这个约柜才被抬出来放在新车上。
So right away, David's decisions affected someone who was abiding by that decision.
那所以大卫的这样的决定，完全的立刻影响到了这些施行这个决定的人。
So that's why, especially in church, right, leadership roles in church are especially important.
那这就是为什么在教会里面带领的这个责任，尤其的重要。
If we have a role in the church that concerns making decisions, we have to be extra careful.
那如果我们在教会里面，需要做一些决定的话，我们就要格外的小心。
Because the decisions we make can have a great impact for those who are abiding those decisions.
那所以因为这些的决定一旦做出，对于那些施行这些决定的人会有很大的影响。
To give a practical example, sometimes we have people in the church that really love to preach the gospel to others.
那比如说在教会里面，我们有很多的人非常喜欢向其他人传福音。
But sometimes when we compromise with the truth and do not stress the importance of salvation from the sacraments, then we really affect this new truth seeker or this new believer.
所以即使我们很喜欢传福音，但是如果我们不坚守真理，尤其是有关圣礼的真理的时候，经常会影响到这位新的慕道者。
Or sometimes if we allow, sometimes if we allow certain things to happen in church, it would give a message to the younger generation that behavior is okay.
那如果教会允许一些现象或者行为的发生的时候，就会给下一代带来一个错觉，好像这样的行为或者现象是可以被允许的。
That will also, the impact will also trickle down to the younger generations of the church, the ones who will be making church decisions and guiding and guiding the congregation of the church in the future.
那这样的影响也会延伸到下一代，这些下一代的人很有可能未来都是会在教会里面，去做担任一些带领的工作和做一些决定工作的一些人。
So from what has happened here, this tells us that truth cannot be compromised.
那在这里告诉我们，真理是不可以妥协的。
The commands of God cannot be compromised.
神的诫命、神的命令是不可以妥协的。
From the Bible, there are clear black and white what is acceptable to God and what is not.
那在圣经里面很黑白分明的写出了神所能接受的是什么，神不能接受的是什么。
So today, if we want to serve God, we must have a service that is aligned with God's commandments and God's words.
那所以，如果我们今天想要侍奉神的话，就要能够按照神的话语和神的诫命来侍奉他。
So aside from a tainted servitude and going against God's words, which David had done both, let us look at David's response to this entire situation.
那如果我们看大卫是如何大卫背逆了神的诫命，并且大卫这样的侍奉是遭到了世界上的玷污，我们来看在这个事件发生之后，大卫的反应又是什么呢？
Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 8 to 9.
那我们来看撒母耳记下的第6章的第8和第9节。
Verse 8, And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. And he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. 9. David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, How can the ark of the Lord come to me?
第8节，大卫因耶和华击杀乌撒，心里忧愁，就称那地方为比列斯乌撒，直到今日。第9节，那日大卫惧怕耶和华，说：耶和华的约柜怎可运到我这里来呢？
So when I was reading these two verses, it's a very conflicting picture for me.
那对于我来说，当我读这2节的时候，好像是一个非常矛盾的画面。
Because in verse 8, David had one emotion, and in verse 9, David had another.
因为在第8节，大卫有了一种样的感觉，在第9节他又有另一样的感觉。
In verse 8, it tells this happened right after Uzzah had just died.
那在第8节是在乌撒刚刚被击杀之后的。
And many of us would sympathize with what happened to Uzzah.
那我们有很多人会同情在乌撒身上所发生的事情。
But David's first response was that he became angry, and he was angry thinking, how could this have happened?
那在这里提到大卫心里愁烦，或者大卫非常的生气，就是在想这样的事情是怎么能发生的呢？
And he even called this place Perez Uzzah.
那在这里甚至称这地方为比列斯乌撒。
And if you look at the footnotes, what this means literally was that God's outburst against Uzzah or against Uzzah.
那在这里，如果我们看底下的小字的话，这个地名的意思就是神击杀乌撒。
And so this place has a negative connotation because this suggests that David originally believed in Uzzah's innocence.
那在这里，这个地名所代表的意思就是大卫是相信乌撒是无辜的。
But in the very next verse, in verse 9, David began to be afraid of the Lord.
那但是在下面一节，大卫就开始惧怕神。
And so he went from being very angry but suddenly very fearful.
所以他一开始是非常的生气的，后来又是非常惧怕。
What had happened in between verse 8 and verse 9?
在第8节和第9节之间发生了什么呢？
How did David go from anger suddenly and then to fear?
那大卫的感情是怎么从愤怒转变为恐惧呢？
Here, now David probably started to reflect and to start to understand why God was so angry.
那在这里，大卫很有可能开始了反思，来思考为什么神会如此的愤怒。
He started and he realized an important concept about servitude.
他突然想到了侍奉上一个很重要的原则，
Which is when we serve God, our service to God must not be self-centered, but God-centered.
那当然，我们侍奉神的时候，不能以自我为中心，而是要以神为中心。
Because when we look at anger, he was angry because he felt like he was originally angry because he was serving God in a very self-centered manner.
那我们在一开始，我们看到大卫愤怒，是因为他以自我为中心的这样的想法和方式来侍奉神。
Because he had this plan laid out in front of him, how to approach this goal of bringing the ark back and how to carry out this plan.
那他在他的面前已经有了一系列的计划，如何将神的约柜运回耶路撒冷，以及怎么样实行这个计划。
So when something happened against his plan, he felt that his anger was justified.
那所以当一些事情发生来打乱他这个计划的时候，他好像觉得自己生气是合乎情理的。
Actually, I'm not sure if any of you has had this experience before.
那我不知道大家是否有这样的经历。
There was one time when I was serving in a global church event.
那有一次我在一个全球性的一个教会活动中来侍奉。
And I was really just helping out because this certain event it really lacked workers.
那我所参加这项圣工的原因，就是因为他们很缺少工人。
But I was not nearly at all ready for coordinating or planning out an event.
但是我却根本就没有预备好自己来组织或者来计划这样的一个活动。
Because the previous generation, some of them, they were starting to move on to other church duties. Some of them were growing very busy, so this had to be handed off to someone else.
因为上一代他们很多人参与了教会其他另一些圣工，并且他们变得非常的忙碌，所以这样的组织的这项圣工就需要其他的人来完成。
And it was only a 10-day event, but a lot of things, didn't really go according to plan.
那虽然只是一个10天的活动，但是很多事情都没有按照计划来进行。
Sometimes you give announcements or you issue like rules, and no one would obey them.
那有时候你会做一些报告，或者告诉他们一些该遵守的规则，但是却没有人理会。
It's actually extremely frustrating, and sometimes you can be very angry. It's like, why? How come it's not working?
有些时候你会觉得非常的愤怒，或者非常的烦躁，好像为什么这样的事情都没有在进行，都没有工作在完成。
So when we find ourselves in this position, we have to slow down and reflect.
那所以当这些事情发生的时候，我们就需要停下我们的脚步来反省。
Whether or not God is pleased with what we are doing.
那对于我们正在做的事情，神是否喜悦呢？
Whether there's anything in our lives that God may not be pleased with.
还是我们生活中有哪一些行为是神所不喜悦的呢？
So to have a servitude that is God-centered and not self-centered, this is a concept we need to internalize.
那这是我们需要化为内在的一个观念，就是我们的侍奉是要以神为中心，而不是以自我为中心。
It's that when we are serving God, we are simply servants of God, and we have to aim to please the Master.
那当我们侍奉神的时候，我们的定位，我们就是仆人，一个仆人所要做的就是取悦他的主人。
For David here, he had his own plan, but none of the things in his plan went according to plan.
那在这里，大卫有他自己的计划，然而在他整个计划里面，没有一件事情是按照他的计划执行的。
So it was wrong of him to be angry.
所以大卫这样的愤怒其实是不合乎情理的。
Because God, as the Master, the Lord, He has every right to make decisions over our own plans.
因为神他是我们的主人，他是完全的能够掌握、掌控，并且控制我们所有的计划。
So therefore, what David should do here is simply submit.
所以大卫在这里所应该做的就是顺服。
And to reflect on why God is so angry with the Israelites and with David on this matter.
那并且反省神为什么在这件事情上对大卫和以色列民如此的愤怒。
This concept also applies to our worldly servitude as well.
那这对于我们在属世上的这样的侍奉也是一样的。
For most of us here who are working in a job, even though we serve a earthly boss, our attitude should still be towards a heavenly master.
那所以我们在现今的世界上打工，虽然我们打工的对象是这世界上的主人，但是也应该抱有一样的态度。
And this concept also applies in the same way in a marriage.
那在婚姻中也是同样的道理。
In a good marriage, the husband and wife aim to serve and also please each other.
那在一段好的婚姻关系里面，夫妻是要互相取悦，并且互相顺服的。
If we know what our spouse likes, we have to aim to please them in that way. Therefore, it's spouse-centered.
那因为如果我们知道我们的配偶喜欢什么的话，就要能够尽量的来取悦他，因为你知道他喜欢这样的方式。
But if one party continues to do what they please, then it will anger the other party.
那如果一方只是顾着自己来做自己所想要做的事情，就会使另外一方变得很生气。
So very likewise, our servitude between us and our master is the same.
那所以对于我们来说，我们和我们的主人之间的侍奉也是这样的。
Because when we serve God, it's not about what we want, but what about our Heavenly Father wants.
因为当我们侍奉神的时候，不是我们自己想要什么，而是我们的天父想要什么。
So, if we continue to read later on through the passage, David did make a second attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant back.
那如果我们继续的读的话，我们就能够发现大卫又第二次的试图将神的约柜运回耶路撒冷。
But in this first attempt, we see that David and the Israelites, they were largely unsuccessful.
但是当我们看这前面一段的时候，我们就知道大卫第一次的试图是失败的。
When the Ark of the Covenant was on its way to be brought into Jerusalem, this disaster stalled this mission.
因为当他们想要将神的约柜运往耶路撒冷的时候，中途发生了这样的灾难，并且把整个计划都打乱了。
So the journey and the journey of our faith and the journey of our servitude is also the same. Sometimes there are going to be obstacles that hinder our servitude.
那所以在我们的侍奉，在我们的信仰路上也是这样，很多的时候，都有一些阻拦会在我们的路上。
Whether this is some personal sin in our own lives,
不论是我们自己生活中我们自己所犯的罪，
whether or not it would be some sort of priority that takes place over God's work,
那还是我们有一个先后的关系，使这个先后的关系让神的工作被延后了。
and whether or not it's sinful desires such as laziness we need to overcome.
那或者还是我们内心的情欲，比如说我们的懒惰，也是我们需要战胜的。
We see that these are the things that can cause that where our servitude can cause harm to us.
那所以我们就知道这些事情会影响我们的侍奉，并且给我们自己带来伤害。
So from David's mistakes here, we learn that if we want to serve God, we must be untainted from the world.
那我们从大卫的这个例子中得到的学习，就是当我们侍奉神的时候，要能够不受这世界的玷污。
We must be pure when we serve God.
当我们侍奉神的时候，是要以一颗清洁的心。
And ultimately, our servitude must be aligned with God's commandments and His laws.
那我们侍奉的时候，要以神的话语和神的律法、神的诫命为基准。
And we need to serve in a way that is centered around pleasing our Master.
那我们所侍奉的动机，就是要能够来取悦我们的主人。
This concludes our evening message.
那我们今晚的讲道到此结束。
Let's rise and sing hymn 452.
那我们一起起立唱诗第452首。